Hello BookTube. I wasn't going to do a book haul today. I figured you've seen enough of those recently on this channel. But then Mark at Richardson Reads made a video and did a book haul today, and he showed off his new easel, his new high-tech easel for displaying books. And then Jason at Byways and Bookland did a book haul on his own channel, separated by an hour at least, or at most, in which he talked relatively normally about a relatively normal bookish subjects, and then went off on an extremely Jason-esque digression about books bound in human skin. Can't pick your friends on this platform, people. But even then, I wasn't sure that I was going to do a book haul, but then they Voxered me, and they were teasing me and taunting me and calling me names and saying that if I didn't do a book haul today, I was a sissy. And since peer pressure is rife on the OGBG, I decided to do a book haul. So that's what I have for you. And it's 3 parts. There are 3 parts to this book haul. The first one is not a store. The first one is, once again, one of those little free libraries. These little boxes that people set up at the end of their garden or at the end of their driveway and fill with free books. You're encouraged to just take one. You're also encouraged to leave one if you happen to have one, or if you're nearby and you want to drop one off. And I have learned, I encounter many of these things up in the leafy suburbs within 45 minutes of my front door. I know those leafy suburbs very well because they are tiny streets, very often curlicues or cul-de-sacs, and they are the nicest people. There are nicest people who live there, and there's absolutely no traffic. The houses are all beautiful, wonderful things to look at. Wouldn't want to live in them, but wonderful things to look at. And the people are very nice, and there's no traffic ever. And that was important when those of you who are new to the channel, there are 100 of you who are new to the channel. I used to have 2 old dogs, 2 sweet old dogs, 3 years ago. I had a pointer and a basset hound, and they grew old together, and they very much enjoyed their walks, but they were so slow. They were so slow, and the basset hound was increasingly both blind and deaf, and you couldn't hurry them. You just couldn't do it. They'd fall over. So I started very much appreciating areas we could walk where there was no traffic, because there was no way to hurry them out of the path of a car. You just had to hope the car would stop, and cars always did. The drivers were never upset. They were always, if anything, touched by the sight of these 2 sweet, white-faced old girls just walking, just plodding along. If you got close enough for them to notice that you were there, they were very friendly. But I've retained those areas. I've got to know a lot of those people, talking to them. So I walk there with Frida, and we encounter these little free libraries all the time. I'd love to set one up here. No technical knowledge whatsoever. I'd love to set one up here and just keep it regularly stocked with books. But Frida and I were passing one of those when I found a book from 2017 that I really liked. I came an inch away from reviewing it for the Christian Science Monitor. I very nearly did. I don't think I actually did. I think I would remember if I did, but I loved it. And the minute I saw it in this free library, I realized I didn't have it. This is by Bill Goldstein, who's a terrific book reviewer. And it's The World Broke in Two. It's the rise of, you've got the concentration here on 4 writers, but also on the modern iteration of modernism. And it's terrific. Just amazing. Especially good on E.M. Forster, but also very good on Virginia Woolf. It didn't win me over on D.H. Lawrence. I don't think anything's ever going to do that. But it was really good about everybody. So I grabbed it from that little free library. So that's part 1. That doesn't even get us to bookstores. And then I went to the Brattle Bookshop. First thing this morning, bitterly early this morning, I had an appointment, and it was relatively near. It was just a block or 2 away from the Brattle Bookshop. And by the time my appointment was done, the Brattle was open. Brattle is a used bookstore in the heart of downtown Boston, and they have 3 floors of reasonably priced books just crammed onto the shelves in every subject imaginable, but they also have a sale lot next door. Just thousands of sale books next door. So I've been going there forever and ever and ever. I love the staff, and they put up with me. and so I realized when I was done with my appointment that the Brattle would be open in a few minutes. So I walked over there to the Brattle, and I got a bunch of stuff. And I want to show you that. I want to show you those things. And the first batch here are mass market paperbacks, and they are science fiction. old mass market paperback science fiction. The aforementioned Mark Richardson, many, many times in pre-plague days, I would take the bean. We would go up to the little old farmhouse in Vermont, and Mark and I would talk the moon down, talking about old science fiction, old fantasy, talking about Star Trek or books in general. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. Hope that it resumes. I hope that it resumes somehow. Vermont's COVID profile is very good. Massachusetts' profile is very good. One can hope. But in those conversations, late at night, Mark and I would often revert to the idea of the next time we saw a big collection of old science fiction mass market paperbacks, we'd just grab them all. Because mass market paperbacks aren't made anymore. Effectively, they aren't made anymore, or hardly any, compared to what they used to be. And the older ones, the vintage ones, science fiction and fantasy typically don't reprint their forebears in the genre. They typically don't care about, the Lynn Carters or the Fritz Leibers of the genre. So you won't get that. And even if you did, you would get it in a $20 trade paperback. You wouldn't get it in an old mass market paperback. So the idea became, in those tipsy late night conversations, became that if you see such a thing, you should just grab them. And then, like manna from heaven, the Brattle bought a huge collection of exactly that. A huge collection of science fiction in mass market paperback. So I got a bunch. I was trying to be discriminating at first. I'm sure I will be back to their collection many times, but I was trying to be discriminating. The first book that I got that I want to show you, just a picture perfect. It's in perfect. No one's ever touched this. It's 35 years old and it looks like it was printed yesterday. And it's a book I've shown you on this channel before. It interests me. I'm not this author's biggest fan, and I admit maybe it was the Rowena cover that interested me originally in getting this thing, because I got it when it came out in 1980. I bought it when it came out for it was $2.50. That was a lot of money back then. But this was a Del Rey book, and I really liked that imprint. So I was money I knew that I would consider well spent. This is by James P. Hogan, and it is Thrice Upon a Time. And that is a Rowena cover. Look at the size of that computer. That cover is meant to juxtapose. You have the set of armor, you have the castle, you have the cat, but you also have what was then the height of modernity, a state-of-the-art computer. This is a standalone novel. It's not part of the series that James P. Hogan did, and I liked it, even notwithstanding the cover. Even once I got past the cover, let's drink in that cover again. I liked it. It's a book about a scientist who stumbles across subatomic particles that seem to be traveling in time. And back in 1980, that was a big stop the presses deal. Modern studies of subatomic physics, that is a fairly standard explanation for some of the things that are weird things that are going on. But this takes place a little bit in the future. I wonder if, now that I think about it, I wonder if Hogan actually gives a year when this is happening. Yes, 2009. Which was far in the future in 1980. And yet, look at the computer. It's a classic. I always use this novel as a classic example of how science fiction authors whose job it is to predict the future, not to predict, but to envision what the future might be like, are often extrapolating along lines they think about and not the lines they don't think about. This book, for instance, has hover cars, but it doesn't have the internet. It has computers, but it doesn't have anything like what we see around us now, when 2009 is the past. It's not the future. It's always fascinating to me. But I seem to remember that the characters were also fairly well done in this book, so I'm going to give it another reread. This is not my only copy, but this is in perfect condition, so it'll stand a reread. And then we have anthologies. When COVID-19 first really struck and looked horrible. I mean, it still does look horrible, especially in America. Oh my God, it was such an embarrassment. But at first it looked, in Massachusetts and New Jersey and New York, it looked like the end of the world. It looked like everybody's going to get sick of this and a whole bunch of people are going to die of it, and everything closed all at once. And until that point in 2020, I had really been enjoying murder mysteries. I've been experiencing a rebirth in my interest in murder mysteries. But once that was in the news, I started becoming interested in science fiction, and especially science fiction short story anthologies. And so I didn't have many of them. I realized that interest was growing. I looked around here at Hyde Cottage. Of course, at the time, early March, mid-March, there was no book buying at all. And I hadn't got used to buying books online at all then. But I looked around, and there were barely any science fiction anthologies here. So I started buying lots of them online. I started going and getting I want a whole box of science fiction anthologies, and I'll just sort through it and see what I want to keep and what I don't. And the whole time that I was doing that, one name was on my mind. And those of you who are fairly younger will think it's Gardner Dozois, who did a whole series of great science fiction anthologies, one every year. Big, fat volumes, very generous. But it's not. And some of you who are a little older might be thinking Don Walheim, who also did a series of science fiction best SF of the year anthologies. It was not him either. No, it's Terry Carr. It's an editor named Terry Carr who did several. He was a prolific editor, did a huge number of series. And one of the things he did was the best science fiction of the year. And he did a volume of a mass market paperback volume of that series for many, many years, well over a decade. And I found a bunch of them at the Brattle for $1 a piece. So we have these are all going to be from the 70s, right? 1976. This is best science fiction of the year, number 5. They had these totally nondescript covers. Most of them did, but they were his Universe series did not. His Universe series had commissioned cover artwork. This did not. But the one of the ways that you know that Terry Carr was really great as a science fiction editor is that you can look at the names from 1976 and realize how many of them are towering figures in the genre now. Let me read you I know it's always the science fiction fans are always of interest here to see what's in here. The Cordwainer Smith story, there'll of course be a Cordwainer Smith story whenever you have one, is Down to a Sunless Sea, not one of his strongest. There's Retrograde Summer by John Varley, which is one of his strongest. There's The Hero is Werewolf by Gene Wolfe, fantastic story. The Silent Eyes of Time by Algis Budrys. There's Croatoan by Harlan Ellison, a fairly easy story, not his usual. Doing Lenin by Gregory Benford. The New Atlantis by Ursula Le Guin. Clay Suburb by Robert F. Young, an author I'm not all that familiar with. The Storms of Windhaven by Lisa Tuttle and George R.R. Martin. And George R.R. Martin, of course, went on to write A Song of Ice and Fire and then leave it unfinished upon his death. But before he did that, he and Lisa Tuttle actually wrote a novel called Windhaven, which is incredible and which was born in this short story. Then Child of All Ages by P.J. Plogger. I don't believe such a person ever existed at all. I believe that's Terry Carr. And then John Barley's story is In the Bowl. And then there's recommended reading as well. These volumes, I read my original copies of these until they fell apart. So it's going to be a delight to go back to these. Then we have number 3 in the series. This has an attempt at cover art, but also a great list of names. Let's see who we have in this one. Someone Up There Likes Me, Something Up There Likes Me by Alfred Bester, who is underrated as a science fiction writer. Not as a science fiction writer. Oh, God. No, he's not underrated as a science fiction writer. He's recognized as a great science fiction writer, but he's underrated as a science fiction short story writer. And that's a shame because his short stories are really, really good. Terry Carr loves them. He's the one who introduced me to those short stories. I encountered them in these volumes. Let's see here. The World as Will and Wallpaper by R.A. Lafferty, whose name came up many times in those science fiction anthologies that I got offline. Let's see here. The Robert Silverberg story is Breckenridge and the Continuum. Not all that familiar with that one. Rumfuddle is the Jack Vance story, not particularly good. The Harlan Ellison story this time around is The Deathbird, which is classic Harlan Ellison, no matter what you think one way or another. Then Of Mist and Grass and Sand by Vonda McIntyre, who made a pile of money for her Star Trek adaptations, so much so that again, a subsequent generation of science fiction fans might know her only by that. Let's see here. The Death of Dr. Island is the Gene Wolfe story. We've seen that in a few other anthologies. That was anthologized to death. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin. Let's see here. Philippe Jose Farmer, Sketches Among the Ruins of My Mind. Philippe Jose Farmer can be good at short stories. His novel sequence didn't really do it for me, but maybe I need to revisit it. Let's see here. The Women Men Don't See by James Tiptree, one of her best stories. And then The Year in Context. So that's number 3. Then we have Oh, wow. This doesn't have a number. Could this be number one? Could this be the first one? The best science fiction of the year. Oh my. Could this be the first volume in the series? Oh, won't that bring back memories? What have we got here? Occam's Scalpel by Ted Sturgeon. The Queen of Air and Darkness by Poul Anderson. In Entropy's Jaws by Robert Silverberg. Again with Philippe Jose Farmer one. This is the Sliced Crosswise Only on Tuesday World. I seem to remember really liking that. A Meeting with Medusa by Arthur C. Clarke. Not a big Arthur C. Clarke fan. I know that's heresy, but I'm not. Let's see here. There's Alexei Panshin, How Can We Sink When We Can Fly? There's Norman Spinrad, which Terry Carr doesn't always pick, No Direction Home. Vaster Than Empires and More Slow is the Ursula Le Guin story. And there's also The Fourth Profession by Larry Niven. Went on to do the Ringworld books. Fascinating. That's fascinating. I'm not 100% sure I've ever read that book. That particular anthology. And then we have number 4. This is the standard. These are in terrible condition. That's probably why they were outside. But I grabbed them right away. Absolutely. I will reinforce these and keep them until they fall apart. And for this one, we have We Purchased People by Fred Pohl. We have Pale Roses by Michael Moorcock. Another Larry Niven story, The Whole Man, H-O-L-E. Born with the Dead by Robert Silverberg, one of his best stories. Let's see here. Bob Shaw is in here, Dark Icarus. Bob Shaw is a science fiction author I really need to revisit. Not only I have a ton of his short stories now, thanks to that pile of anthologies, but also his novels. A Little Something for Us Tempenauts by Philip K. Dick. Several of you have been disappointed over the years in the fact that I am not a Philip K. Dick fan, and you'll be pleased to know that I am edging towards a reread. A giant systematic reread of the type that I typically do with authors when I'm not their biggest fan. I'm edging towards that with Philip K. Dick, so stay tuned. William Tenn's story on Venus, Have We Got a Rabbi? It's been forever since I read that story. I loved it. Everybody that read it loved it at the time, but I should reread that. Oh my. On Venus, Have We Got a Rabbi? And then If the Stars Were Gods by Gordon Eklund and Greg Benford, which again became a book. Fantastic. So those are 4 Terry Carr anthologies. My only 4 at the moment. I don't have any others. So imagine that. And Terry Carr was an institution. He was well known in the industry, well known in the genre, a tastemaker, but never snobby about it. And his anthologies were well known. They were you could count on them every year, much like Gardner Dozois. Another fantastic anthology series is this one, again in perfect condition. This was by Lynn Carter, edited these, and it was the Flashing Swords anthology, and this is number 1. Flashing Swords number 1. And this is not science fiction so much as fantasy. I think this only has 4 things in it, number 1. But I bet there were others, or will be others. What have we got here? Okay, there's an introduction by Lynn Carter. That's great. That's great on its own. Then there's a Farford and Gray Mouser story by Fritz Leiber, The Sadness of the Executioner. There's a tale from Jack Vance's Dying Earth series. There's The Mermans Children by Poul Anderson, which is, if I remember correctly, about Vikings. And there's The Higher Heresies of Ulamar by Lynn Carter. Breaking the foremost Steve rule, you should not include yourself in your own anthology, but I don't care. I don't care. I'll gladly read it. So that was to start off my day at the Brattle. That was a lot of science fiction and fantasy in mass market paperbacks. So that was like a Vermont farmhouse dream come true. And then this next one I mentioned last time I went to the Brattle that to a thrift shop. I mentioned that these thrift shop trips are going to start to raise real issues about how comfortable I am buying printed books when I am now so deep into the world of ebooks. I put out the call for EPUB format ebooks, and several of you have been extremely generous with loading me with ebooks of every kind and description, with your just sharing your collections in a way that I shouldn't be surprised because you're wonderful people. And as a result, I now have a fairly sizable ebook collection as a library, just on a slate of metal and plastic that isn't taking up any shelf space, that is infinitely searchable, that's infinitely comfortable to read and reread. And I'm wondering what kind of a slow drag that's going to have on me getting books, printed books, at used venues. And I thought that one of the ways that would bring that to the highlight would be if I encountered a used book, a printed book, at a bookshop or a thrift shop, for which I had one of those new EPUB ebooks, and that happened. That happened at the Brattle today, and I got the book anyway because it was $1. But I don't know if that's going to stay true. And it's a book that I've had before many times. Sorry, it's a little warm in this room. And it's Hannibal Rising by Thomas Harris. I believe this was on not only one, but 2 library tours here. I just keep getting rid of it. I keep giving copies away. This is Thomas Harris's revision. It's not a long book. It's his dramatization, his narrative of the formative years of Hannibal Lecter. And it's meant to give a kind of dark, twisted origin story for what made Hannibal Lecter become a monster, made him become a serial killer. When I heard advance warning about this book, I thought, okay, well, that's the last thing we need. You're walking a fine line with Hannibal Lecter. You've somehow invented a character who is a monster, but who your fans love. They don't revile him. They love him. So you are walking a fine line between not making him repulsive and yet underscoring the fact that he is a monster, someone who kills people recreationally. And Harris has come up with, in the course of the Hannibal Lecter books, he comes up with a number of ways to get around that, tries to anyway, at one point in The End of Silence of the Lambs, and then in the novel Hannibal, the idea is floated that Hannibal Lecter only kills rude people. That is obviously not true. And so on and so forth. You know what I mean. Harris tries to have it both ways. He has to. He doesn't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, but he also doesn't want to endorse what Hannibal Lecter is. And the advance word on this book was that it was going to be Hannibal Lecter's childhood and the trauma therein, because we get sketchy glimpses of that in the novel Hannibal, of things that happened to his sister Misha when their landed estate was invaded by the Nazis. And I bet you can guess what that is. Some brutish soldiers who took over the Lecter estate did something to Misha that Hannibal Lecter then becomes famous for doing to victims. And I thought, you don't want to justify this. You don't want to justify this character. There's no justification for this character. He's a monster. That's why there's no justification for him. But this book turned out to be something very different. There's one caretaker figure in teen dream Hannibal Lecter's life, a sort of quasi-parental figure named Lady Murasaki, and she begs him not to embrace the dark side. She begs him, she says, you are attracted to darkness. Don't be. Fight against it. Come with me to a place of sanctuary, of safety. And I reread this just a little while ago, and right before I gave it away, I reread it, and I noticed something I'd missed before, which is that in the scene where Lady Murasaki is urging him not to embrace the dark side, she's also making out with him. So she herself is perverted. Hannibal never had a chance not to be warped. And I have an e-copy of this that I think 3 of you sent me, knowing that I'm a fan of this author. I got the book anyway, and I admit I'm feeling a little ambivalent about it. I definitely am. I don't know how many times more I will do that out of sheer momentum or anything else. And then this next one is, I got it only because it's a hardcover, and I want the hardcover for my collection. I found a trade paperback in the aforementioned Vermont. This is Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf in a nice hardcover, and the previous owner of this filled it with clipped book reviews and whatnot. I love that when people do that. So this, I'm just going to pull out the trade paperback, put this right on the shelf in its place. Then this next one, oh boy, this next one is amazing. This is by Shirley Gouton. This is A World by Itself, a beautiful volume. This is from the 1950s, I think, or maybe the 1970s, 1977. And this is about the islands in the northern part of the Venetian Lagoon, Murano and its sister islands, who have tenaciously, for a while there, hung on to their own regional identities, their own individual identities, apart from the money-making tourist megalomania of Venice itself. And this author did a previous book just on Murano that was called No Magic Eden, and I don't have that, but I found this at the Brattle today, and this is sort of the sequel to that. And if this showed up at the Brattle, then No Magic Eden will show up at the Brattle. And those of you maybe new to the channel, I'm a big fan of Venice and by extraction of books on Venice. I love reading them, and I don't think I've ever read this. I think I read the first one. And I've spent a lot of time on all of those islands. A lot of time. I know every inch, every brick, every blade of grass, every campanile. I know I've spent a lot of time on those islands. But I don't think I've ever read this book. The sheer joy of finding a Venice-related book that I haven't read, that's just wonderful. And then the last book that I found at the Brattle, it is not the last book on our book haul, on my peer pressure book haul. This is by Jane Yolen, and it's illustrated by John Schoner, and it's called Owl Moon. It won the Caldecott back in 1980s, the early 1980s, I want to say. 1987. It won the Caldecott back in 1987. And it's about a man and his daughter who go tramping out on the woods at night in hopes of seeing a great horned owl. And that's all that the story is just the passage of time. They go out and make their owl calls to try to attract a great horned owl. They just tromp through the woods. And I fell in love with this book as soon as I read it. I have done this very thing many times, gone out and tried to find great horned owls. 20 years ago, there was a mating pair in Forest Hill Cemetery, which is not far from where I was living at the time, and I went out there. I tramped in all weathers to catch a glimpse of them, to catch a glimpse of them at twilight when they were waking up and beginning to get ready for hunting. And I did. I got a couple of glimpses. It's much harder than it looks. It's easy to spot an owl during the day when they're dazed by the sunlight and when they're being mobbed by crows or sparrows or jays or whatever. But at night, in a quiet setting, the Forest Hills Cemetery is an old Victorian cemetery. It's sprawling, huge, and mostly wilderness. So it's the owl's territory. And the idea that one will let you see it in a circumstance like that doesn't always happen. So I fell in love with this book when it first came out, and I've given away so many copies of this book over time, I don't even know. But the only copy that I have is a paperback that's falling apart, and this is a hardcover. So I was very happy to find that, and these were all dirt cheap. So that only added to the fun of it all. But that wasn't the end of my book haul day, because when I was done with the Brattle, I visited an old friend of mine. I have an old friend who runs a church here in Boston, and I went to visit him. He was asking after me, wanted to know if you have it in you, I'd love it if you'd swing by so we could talk. So I did. I swang by, and he heard my confession, and we chatted about he used to do a regular book sale in his church basement. He can't do that anymore. He's had a trickle of books coming in anyway, and he always gives me first shot at those books because I've done him a couple of favors over the decades, and I have told him many times that I don't expect anything in return, and you know that perfectly well, because when you do favors you don't expect anything in return. But nevertheless, he insists on letting me look over the books before they go to the book sale, and there's not going to be a book sale in this case anyway, but he insists on it. He insists on it. I recently did a good turn for one of his parishioners, dog related turn, a sweet little old lady who got a new dog, and her dog was a terror, tearing things apart, savagely attacking anybody who came to the apartment, barking all day long, barking all night long, peeing and pooping in the house. And she was at her wit's end, thinking, well, I don't want to give the dog away. They might end up in a shelter and die or whatever. And she went to her priest to figure out what can be done. Word eventually got to me that maybe you could go and find out, maybe go and talk to this dog. So I went to this lady's apartment, and she was peeking through the crack in the door saying, oh, you have to be really careful, he's going to want to bite you. And I said, no, he's not going to want to bite me, take my word for it. She opened the door, and the dog was lunging at me and barking, and I told the dog, shut up right now. Who on earth do you think you're barking at? And the dog flattened on the ground like a piece of paper, and she said, what on earth did you do? And I had a conversation with her and with her little dog. Didn't take more than 5 seconds to realize what the problem was. The dog was bored silly, just bored insane. I told her that, and she said, well, I can't play with the dog all day long. I mean, I got the dog for companionship. I can't be running around and playing all day long. What should I do? And I said, the solution is obvious. Get another dog. I will get you another dog. I will introduce them to each other. I will socialize with them with each other, and I will teach you all the ways to have two dogs instead of one. It's not As I always used to tell people, having a second dog, having two dogs instead of one is not twice as hard. It's about 10% harder. You're not doubling. In fact, you're saving yourself trouble in a lot of ways. And we did that. It was a time-consuming process. I found a dog who needed a home. I found the right kind of dog, someone who's still in the size range that this old lady could handle. And I socialized them. I laid down the rules for them, and the problems went away. Completely went away. As I knew they would, because this little dog had no one to talk to, no one to do anything with. And as if anything else weren't bad enough, my old friend continues to want to pay me back for that. When what would I have done otherwise? Nothing. It wasn't anything at all. It was a little bit a cumbersome bother, and I paid the adoption fees, but that's nothing at all. But he insists on letting me look at the books, so I did this time, and I grabbed 4 books. And the first one is a mass market romance. It's by Amy Sandus, and it is The Untouchable Earl. Hubba hubba. And that is the cover with that type font. And I looked at this thing and I thought, oh, do you already have that? I film these videos looking at my romance bookshelf. And I could swear that I had an Amy Sandus book looking me in the face every single time I filmed. And I thought, wouldn't it be foolish to grab this if you already have a copy? But I came back and checked, and I have this. Lord of Lies. They look very similar in terms of type font and organization on the cover, but they are not, in fact, the same. So now I have 2 Amy Sandus. So that's the first one. I'm always up for one of these saucy new Regency romances, always up for that. And then the next one was, I am working up a review, on R.B. Bernstein's book, The Education of John Adams, a slim intellectual biography of John Adams. And of course, the title of the book itself evokes Henry Adams's book, The Education of Henry Adams, one of the great works of nonfiction in American history, in American literature. And when I was working up that review, I realized that I have a Penguin Classic of The Education of Henry Adams, but I don't have anything else. And this was right there. This is the Mariner Books trade paperback of The Education of Henry Adams with a Donald Hall introduction that I seem to remember really liking. So I will reread the introduction and probably a chunk of the book before I put the final touches on that review. And then the next one, this is by Marvin Kittman. This is a sequel to a book that caught on of his as a new trade paperback. This is The Making of the President, 1789, an unauthorized campaign biography of George Washington. This is a new trade paperback. And it's not new, I mean, this trade paperback is old. But the originals didn't look like this. And this was a sequel to... does this have... Okay, John Cleese does the foreword for this book. And... The original book was George Washington's expense account, which I was kind of hoping I would see right next to this one, but I didn't. And they are George Washington books, yes, so you would think that I maybe wouldn't like them, but they're unconventional and really, really good, and also very funny. So when I saw this, I grabbed it, especially since these didn't cost anything. And then the last one is by Mary Lovell, and this is The Sisters. Big fat book on the Mitford sisters. I don't have this. I used to have a hardcover of this. I used to have a big collection of the Mitford letters. There's a big, beautiful collection of their letters. I don't have that either. I used to have Debo, the Duchess of Devonshire, the last living Mitford sister, wrote a couple of fairly charming featherweight light memoirs late in her life, and I used to have those as well, and I didn't anymore. She was the biggest personality in the Mitford sisters circle, and made a big impression on everybody that knew her, including John F. Kennedy, who, when he would call the Prime Minister of the UK during his tenure in office, he would often assume a very sonorous, very serious voice and say, "How are things with NATO? And how are things with Cito? And how are things with Debo?" This is the kind of the effect she had. It was just kind of a living monument. And so when I saw this, I grabbed it. I read this when it first came out back in 2003. Was it 2003? 2001. I read this back then, but I will gladly read it again. And there you go. That was my peer pressure book haul. An enormous thing. I don't even know if we can do a Steve Pyramid. We have Owl Moon, one of the best children's books I've ever read. We have The World Broken 2 by Bill Goldstein, really good literary history. We have Hannibal Rising, the otherwise regrettable movie starred Gaspar Ulliel, We have Shea Heaney's translation of Beowulf. We have Shirley Gouton's A World by Itself, about the islands in the Venetian lagoon. What else do we have here? The Sisters, about the Mitford sisters. We have The Making of a President, 1789, sort of a play on the Jules Wickover books, The Making of the President, 1964, 1968, that sort of thing. The Education of Henry Adams, in a trade paperback. We have The Untouchable Earl by Amy Sandus. Thrice Upon a Time by James Hogan. And a bunch of science fiction anthologies in mass market paperback. How nice is that? Good Lord. And that's it. That is my book haul to go along with Mark's and Jason's. So I'm going to wrap this up. This went long as usual, but that was a lot of books. So I'll wrap this up, but I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.